Right. So my topic today is why the United Nations cannot deliver peace. Right. But before I move into that, I'll explain my sort of credentials or experience. So since 2009, I've represented various countries as a diplomat in discussing international issues. So I used to be that guy speaking at the podium, but in recent years, for example, this was taken just this past weekend at Yale West. I've moved on to the role of chair, where I basically wield the gavel and I decide who gets to speak and who gets the right to shut up. Yeah. Right. So, talking about the United Nations, it was founded at the end of 1945 after the Second World War ended. And as we know, there were 5 allied powers that won the war: the Soviet Union, the United States, Britain, as well as France and China. Although they sort of lost, but they were on the winning side in the end. Right? And so when these 5 powers ganged up with some other smaller countries to form the UN, they arrogated to themselves veto powers, which I'll explain later. So my presentation is not to diss the UN. It has done a lot of humanitarian work in the past 70 years, be it promoting food security, women's rights, children's welfare, healthcare, and so on, and cultural heritage. But my beef is with the United Nations Security Council, where the 5 allied powers have remained until now. And they retain the power to veto any actions which they deem to be unfavorable to themselves. Right? I'll be sharing about 3 specific examples in the coming slides about how they have failed to uphold international security. So first that I want to discuss would be the Korean War. On 25th June 1950, Kim Il-sung ordered the North Korean army to invade South Korea. They crossed the 38th parallel on that same day. And while the United States was frantically trying to get the United Nations to condemn the invasion perpetrated by the Communist bloc, the Soviet Union managed to veto every single resolution. And as a result, the United States had to turn to the UN General Assembly, which passed UN Resolution 377A. It's a different 377A. It's called Uniting for Peace. You can search it up on Wikipedia. Basically, this was the only time where all the assembled countries of the world were able to override the power of the Security Council. However, the United States did not use this opportunity to end the war. Rather, it fought a 3-year war, which eventually ended up with millions of casualties. And after 3 years of war, as we know, the Korean Peninsula remains divided. So, whereas the United States should have upheld its role as a global policeman and maintain peace, it sought to fight the Communist bloc in the Cold War. And here we have the Vietnam War, and then we also have the Afghanistan War, where the Soviets sent in the Red Army to Afghanistan and fought a war there for over a decade. So, you may be wondering, what was the United Nations doing during all these decades of the Cold War? Why did it not seek to stop all these proxy conflicts? It's simply because the global policemen, the 5 global policemen, were themselves the criminals. And here we have scenes from the Rwanda genocide, which is my second example case study. Right. The United Nations had already posted Belgian peacekeepers to the country for months prior to the genocide. However, the United Nations decided to do nothing about reports that the Rwandan government was attempting to murder the majority of its citizenry. Precisely because the United States and other allied powers decided that Rwanda is in a godforsaken corner of Africa. There's no oil, no gold there. There's no strategic interest, so why should we care? But as a result, it led to a regional configuration which is now known as the African Continental War. Now, third example would be the Balkan Wars. As we know, when Yugoslavia disintegrated at the end of the Cold War, it broke up into many ethnically based republics. And the Serbians were trying to maintain their power at all costs, and so they perpetrated many massacres. But the worst failing of the United Nations comes in this. They promised civilians that they would have United Nations safe havens to go to, like the map that we saw just now, the town of Srebrenica. They promised that if civilians were to flee there, they would not come under attack. However, they did not back it up. They did not back up their words, and they allowed the Serbians to massacre them. Right? So that was in the 20th century. And now we have examples coming from last decade. For example, when Bush Jr. Decided to invade Iraq and restore freedom and democracy to the country. And we have the Syrian War, which started off in 2011 as a series of civil protests, but now it's become a full regional configuration. Right. This is not to say that the United Nations Security Council has done absolutely nothing in maintaining international peace. In fact, it has sanctioned a lot of peacekeeping missions around the world. For example, in Haiti, in various parts of Africa, as well as the Middle East. Right? However, we must note that the United Nations can only be as effective as its nations are indeed united. But this is rarely achieved. For example, an example of Yemen and so on. Right? What is happening in Yemen now is that various countries, including Saudi Arabia and Iran, they are stoking up civil war in the region. However, none of the countries are actually willing to do anything about it. So, in my past 3 examples, I've talked about how the world, or rather how the United Nations Security Council has relied too much on the world's policemen to enforce global security, namely the United States. And we also understand that the United Nations Security Council has the sole prerogative of maintaining international peace and order. However, the Security Council has been dominated for the past 70 years by the 5 allied nations, and they've abused their veto power. There are other problems with maintaining international peace and security now. Because in the past 70 years, the nature of violence has changed dramatically. In the past, it used to be wars between states, but now we have the problem of sovereignty, which is one reason why the United States and other countries have been reluctant to send in ground forces and topple Assad's government. Another problem is non-state actors. In the 1990s, we had organizations like Taliban and after that Al-Qaeda, but now we have Islamic State and we don't know how to deal with them at all because they don't fit our conventional definitions of state actors or sovereignty or violence. So why am I saying this and how is this relevant to Singaporeans? I believe it is very relevant to Singaporeans because Singapore is a small country, we are in a volatile region, and our defense policy has always been based on deterrence and diplomacy. However, as we have seen, diplomacy can only get us so far when the United Nations Security Council couldn't care less about those conflicts. So that's food for thought. Thank you.